Hello, I'm here to talk today about a subject that's really important for the health of children and the health of societies. This is the influence of lead and lead exposure, lead poisoning, lead toxicity on all of us. And we have to be aware of this, we have to know what's happening, and we have to be conscious. There are things we can do to prevent problems associated with lead exposure. This is a talk that I gave to the Manitoba Pediatric Society on February 23rd, 2021, and here we go. The title I chose for this talk is Lead Poisoning of Children, a Significant Issue in Manitoba Today. And I will, as the evidence that I show indicates, the answer is almost certainly yes. How I got started. There are many people who've been raising issues of concerns of lead exposure in Winnipeg in the last few years, and indeed going back for the last several decades. Second, Winnipeg and Manitoba have a very high crime rate, and this has not been explained. Third, children with learning disabilities are known to be disproportionately involved in crime. And children who are exposed to lead often develop such learning disabilities. So this may be part of the link here. And recent evidence has shown increasingly that lead exposure in children is related to crime when the children become adults. In Winnipeg, we have had high lead soil levels in areas of industrial activity where there were lead smelters, scrap metals operations, lead batteries, computer recycling. There are lead pipes in many parts of Winnipeg for drinking water. There are many homes with lead paint, older homes, of course, but still here. There has been lead in shot used for hunting game, and although it's not allowed anymore for migratory birds, it is still being used in some areas. There may be some residual contamination of the soil from the earlier lead gasoline use, and ceramics, toys, and spices sometimes will have lead associated with them. First of all, to this issue of crime in Winnipeg and Manitoba, we have a very high violent crime severity index. As you can see on the right, Manitoba, MB, is off the charts in terms of violent crime compared to other provinces. In fact, we are more than twice as severe in terms of violent crime as almost all other provinces, and only Alberta and Saskatchewan are a little bit higher, but not anywhere near what Manitoba is. Second, the question of lead and its effect on behavioral and learning problems is exemplified here by showing the association of lead with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And what you see here on the bottom is that as the blood lead concentration increases above 1 microgram per deciliter, and particularly above 2 micrograms per deciliter. The AOR, which is the adjusted odds ratio, the likelihood that a child will get ADHD increases quite significantly. Note that the levels here are increasing when it's above 1 and above 2. This is actually very important because people have found that the effects of lead occur at very low concentrations. This is a slide which shows the link between lead in the air and crime, the aggravated assault rate. This was a study that was done by Mielke and Saran in New Orleans. And what they did, on the left, you have the metric tons of lead in the air. And the metric tons went from about 150 up to 450 at a peak following the introduction of leaded gasoline and the increase in the number of cars using leaded gasoline. And then the peak and the use of lead in gasoline dropped precipitously when lead was banned. from gasoline, and there was a big fall in the amount of lead in the air back to the baseline. And what you see on the right, 22 years later, this is the time it takes from the effect of lead on the developing brain while the infant is very early on in the first few years of life exposed to lead, and the incidence of crime. And what you see is that in parallel, 22 years later, there is a big increase in crime, and it goes from an aggravated assault rate of about 300, triple that, up to about 900. And that this incidence of crime in New Orleans then fell precipitously back down to the baseline as 22 years after this decline in air lead. And the implications of this are that exposure of the fetus and the infant in the first few years of life to lead has an effect on the developing brain. That effect on the developing brain then causes changes in the brain, which lead to higher crime rates and more likely crime as the infant grows up and becomes late teens and early 20s. A high incidence of crime is seen. And then, of course, when lead falls, 22 years later, the incidence of aggravated assaults dropped dramatically. That pattern was shown in many other cities, in different states. It was shown in many countries, and every time it is held up. But the pattern of relationship of lead to crime doesn't just apply to a situation with lead in gasoline. Here's a study which looks at the homicide rate in cities, and the red triangles here are cities which had lead water pipes, and the black circles are cities which had iron water pipes. And these are cities scattered all over the United States, and for varied reasons, some cities chose one and some cities chose the other. And there was no particular difference or reason for some having lead pipes, except in some cases, the cities were a little closer to sources of lead. But what you're seeing here is an increased number of homicides across this span of 1921 to 1936. Before, there was this burst of lead in gasoline. And this was compared with cities with iron used for water pipes. This is a slide which takes us a step further. It is when the water is acidic that the lead is leached out of the pipe and put into the water. And so when these cities have acidic water, what you see is that there is a much bigger increase, relative increase in homicides compared to cities where there was iron pipes used. In contrast, cities where the water was basic, the pH was greater than 7, that in these cities, the lead is not leached out of the water by basic water. And so the lead in the water doesn't increase in the drinking water. And what you have is no difference between the cities where there were lead pipes and those cities where there were iron pipes. Again, linking the lead closely to this change in homicide rates. Now, there are many, many other studies which all show essentially the same thing. That crime, and particularly violent crime, is associated with an increase in a child's blood lead level. This is a study from Billings and Schneppel, which was done in Charlotte, Mecklenburg County in North Carolina. And this looks at the percent of children ever arrested for a violent crime. There were several thousand children involved in this study. And what they found, most children were down in this area with very low lead levels. But as you got the increased lead level, you got an increase in the percent of children arrested for a violent crime. So that when you got to above 10 micrograms per deciliter, you got the highest levels of violent crime. Now, this study was done so that there was not only this group, 10/NI, where the initial blood lead level was about 10 micrograms per mil. There was also an intervention group. And they did a second blood lead level. And the second blood lead level in this group was between 5 and 10. And that is an area where there are still major effects of lead. What happened here is that there was two tests which had blood lead levels above 10 micrograms per mil. And these children were given an intervention. And that intervention consisted of, number one, efforts to remediate the home and reduce lead exposure. Sometimes this was quite expensive. The average lead remediation cost was $7,000, more than $7,000 US dollars per family. They also changed the nutrition to make sure that there was adequate calcium in milk and other changes. And there was an assessment, not only of lead sources in the home, but more broadly, but also an assessment of the child in terms of their learning and behavior. But what you see here is that where that intervention was used, there was a dramatic reduction in violent crime. Now, those first lead tests, blood lead tests, were done when the children were ages 1 to 3. And so early intervention dramatically reduces violent crime. That's a really important message, something that we need to learn. And that's one of the reasons why it is so important to be testing children early where there's any concern over increased lead levels. Why does lead cause crime or lead to crime? So this is a summary. It's elaborate and shows that there are multiple pathways. At the top, you will see lead exposure of pregnant mothers or infants, causing altered brain development in the child during fetal life and in the first few years of life. This leads to a lowered IQ, well documented after lead, difficulties with learning, again, well documented after lead, with behavioral problems, well documented after lead. And one of the issues is impaired impulse control. And it appears that the problems with learning and IQ compared with a reduced impulse control are triggers for an increase in antisocial behavior and juvenile delinquency. There is also an interesting effect, sad effect of lead exposure directly to promote substance abuse. This has been shown very clearly in animals, and there's substantial evidence for this in humans. And so whereas many have blamed increased alcohol use as a cause of crime, it may well be that part of this is that the lead exposure directly promotes alcohol use because of the changes in the brain or other drugs, and that this is one of the factors and one of the reasons why substance abuse is often associated with crime. Now we're going to move to the situation in Manitoba. And here in Manitoba, we have measured and got information on 5,000 blood lead tests done, which were above point, and the number of these which were above 0.24 micromoles per liter. Now, 0.24 micromoles per liter is the same as 5 micrograms per deciliter. And what we're seeing here is that between 8 and 14% of all these tests were positive, that is, that they had high lead levels. Further, because there's in part more lead tests being done, the total number of positive blood lead tests or high blood lead tests rose from over 40 to close to 100 in the last few years. And so this is a significant issue in Manitoba. There are not a lot of details because we weren't provided information on the age of the people who were tested. We know a little bit about the geography of where people were testing with higher lead levels. Now, this is a map of Winnipeg, the city of Winnipeg, and what it shows, these areas where there are red are areas where there were and are homes which have lead pipes. Now, these lead water pipes are what I've showed earlier on is a problem because the lead can leach from the pipes into the water. And studies in the last few years have shown that 20%, that's 1 in 5 homes with lead water pipes have high levels of lead in the water. So this is a problem. And interestingly enough, this area where there is red and there are a lot of homes with lead water pipes matches to the area where there is the highest crime rates in the city of Winnipeg as well. Now, there was a study which was done by Intrinsic Corporation, November 29th, 2019. It was an assessment of elevated lead in the soil in Winnipeg neighborhoods. And what they did as part of this study was to take the information on the soil in Winnipeg neighborhoods and use a model which estimated the blood lead levels in the children in these neighborhoods. So this slide shows the predicted, not the measured, the predicted blood lead levels in children from 6 months to 3 years. And they predict that in North Point, Douglas, that the average in the first 3 years of life is more than 5 micrograms per deciliter. That's high for an average that's in the toxic range. For Weston, it was above 3 micrograms per deciliter. Daniel McIntyre above 2, Centennial, and then all the way down to River Osborne above 1 and the background lower. Now, the study authors used this information to estimate the number of children who would have a level of lead, which was above 2 micrograms per deciliter. Now, they chose 2 micrograms per deciliter as the area or the level of concern, in part because of the evidence that I've already presented, that 2 micrograms, you're starting to see significant effects of lead. And what they found was that 97% of children in North Point, Douglas would have levels of greater than 2 micrograms per deciliter. 70% of children in Weston would have levels greater than 2 micrograms per deciliter, and 40% of children in Daniel McIntyre, all the way down to River Osborne, which was just under 10%, which is still too many children. The background, of course, is way down here. As you can see, virtually no children. So other areas of Winnipeg where there were not lead pipes tend to have very, very low background levels. Now, there have been sites outside Winnipeg also with high lead levels. Portage la Prairie, Brandon, Dauphin, Selkirk, Flin Flon, Pine Falls, Saugeen. There is a possibility that there may be high lead levels in some First Nations communities. Now, we don't have measures from Manitoba, but there is a study of 3 remote communities in Northern Ontario near the James Bay. And what they found was that 18% of the people sampled in these communities had high blood lead levels. And by high blood lead levels, at that point, they were looking at above 10 micrograms per mil, so we would consider that very high. Why is this? The study authors suggested that this was related to the fact that people were still using lead shot for hunting geese, ducks, and so on, and that this may be the source of lead. I've talked to elders in the First Nations communities, and they suggest that there's an alternate explanation, and that is that the residential schools had a lot of lead paint on their walls and had lead ceiling tiles. So children who were living there for years, 24 hours a day in these schools, may have been affected. And mothers who were in residential schools may have built up high lead levels in their bones, and that these mothers may then have, during pregnancy, passed the high lead over to their children at the time of birth. Now, that's all speculation at this point, because there's not much known about or evidence in terms of levels in Indigenous communities in Manitoba, but it is a concern for us, given the results in the James Bay area. Now, I asked then Health Minister Cameron Friesen, if he'd monitor blood lead levels in children in the legislature. He said no, but he did say that every family and their doctor can monitor levels of blood. So if you have a concern about possible exposure to lead in your family, you can take that to your doctor, and your doctor can check blood lead levels on you or your children. Who should have a blood lead test? Now, based on the evidence that I've been able to put together, children aged 1 to 3 living in an area where lead exposure may be higher, children aged 1 to 3 where there are any concerns the mother or children may have had lead exposure, an older house with lead paint, eating country food, which may have lead shot, parent working in lead industry are examples. Children with ADHD, we've talked about that earlier, children with other learning and or behavioral problems, children in child and family services care. There's a study in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, showing a very high proportion of children in CFS care there had high lead levels. We don't know if that applies here in Manitoba, but it is, I raise it here as a concern. Youth with substance abuse issues. This, again, is a concern, and if we can help youth by lowering lead levels, then that would be a good thing. What needs to be done when the blood lead level is high? General recommendations at the moment are that for blood lead levels between 0.1 to 0.23 micromole per liter, that is 2 to 4.9 micrograms per deciliter, it's important to talk to parents about sources of lead and about nutrition as it relates to lead absorption. Nutrition is tremendously important here because lead is brought into the body through a calcium transporter. And so if you've got plenty of calcium in the diet, and usually that means milk or dairy products, then your likelihood of absorbing lead is much less. And so calcium in the diet can be very protective against high lead levels. For blood lead levels of 0.24 micromoles per liter, 5 micrograms per deciliter or greater, the Canadian Pediatric Society recommends this as the level of concern, as do other jurisdictions. You need to assess the potential sources of the lead, soil, water, paint, lead shot, etc., and the sources both to the child and to the mother. You need to provide advice on measures to reduce lead exposure. You need to provide advice in relationship to nutrition, as I've mentioned, in particular to ensure adequate calcium from milk or other sources. The child's development, learning behavior needs to be assessed and followed. It's important to note that the government of Manitoba has allocated money for lead remediation. And so if a child is found to have high lead levels and the family needs help with the costs of lead remediation, they should get in touch with their MLA to apply for these funds and help them make sure that they can clean up the lead exposure. Is the impact of lead exposure lifelong? In the medical literature, it's often stated that the impact on learning and intelligence is not reversible. However, this may not be the case. One of the major studies which is cited, which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, is flawed. They didn't have adequate remediation and removal of lead from the environment. The study of Billings and Schneppel, which I showed early on, shows that the impact on violent crime is reversible by early intervention. Intervention in their study also improved many other aspects, including school learning, although not as much in the case of school learning. There's anecdotal evidence as well, which suggests that the effects of lead can be reversible. I talked to an individual who grew up in Weston, which is a heavily contaminated area of Winnipeg. He described his time in early school years as very difficult because his mind was in a fog. I think this was from his lead exposure. Fortunately for him, he moved, or his family moved, and life improved for him, and he has been a very successful real estate salesman in Winnipeg for many years. So there is anecdotal evidence that suggests it can be reversed. And indeed, that fits with a lot of work now saying that the brain is much more plastic than people ever believed. But it is important to note that if there's no intervention, that the lead exposure and the high lead levels can impact adult health, particularly mental health, being associated with increased depression and anxiety, and perhaps with increased dementia. So is lead poisoning of children a significant issue in Manitoba today? Probably, I think almost certainly yes, but we need more work. For more information, read our report on lead and crime in Manitoba and the need for urgent action. It can be found on my Member of the Legislature Assembly, MLA website, https://www.johngerardmla.ca/. Thank you.